This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of woman no one worries about. She gets up on time. She answers messages. She remembers birthdays. She keeps the fridge stocked, the bills paid, the tone polite, the meeting moving, the family steady. She is not the woman people check on. She is the woman people depend on. The woman who knows how to keep her face composed in a grocery store aisle, how to say I'm good before anyone asks twice, how to swallow a feeling before it becomes inconvenient for the room. And that is exactly why no one notices when something inside her starts disappearing. Not all breakdowns are loud. Some happen in silence. Some happen while I am smiling. Some happen while I am loading the dishwasher, nodding through a meeting, answering a text with a heart emoji I do not feel. Some happen so gradually that even I cannot name the exact day I left myself behind. I only know that one day I looked at my own life and realized I had become fluent in things that were never love, tolerating, shrinking, smoothing, excusing, staying soft in places where I should have had edges. I had become excellent at managing everybody else's comfort and strangely estranged from my own. There is a particular grief in realizing I did not lose my voice all at once. I gave it away in pieces. A little bit at work, when I let someone with less clarity and more confidence talk over me. A little bit in love, when I kept calling disrespect miscommunication because I did not want to seem difficult. A little bit with family, when I answered to versions of myself I had outgrown years ago. A little bit online, where people perform boldness but rarely carry wisdom. A little bit in my own mind, where I learned to question my instincts before I trusted them. And the frightening part is this: from the outside, none of it looked dramatic enough to count. That is how so many women disappear. Not in one catastrophic moment. Not in one obvious betrayal. But in 100 small moments where I knew something did not sit right in my spirit, and I chose silence because silence felt easier to manage than conflict, easier to explain than anger, easier to survive than truth. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is fear in a silk dress. Sometimes silence is self-abandonment wearing the language of maturity. Sometimes silence is a woman so used to being understood as good that she would rather betray herself than be misunderstood for 1 minute. And that is where this conversation begins. Before I learned how to become more honest, I thought maturity meant being agreeable. I thought being grown meant staying calm no matter what, never letting anyone know they had crossed a line, never making a scene, never sounding too emotional, too sharp, too intense, too much. I thought the strongest woman in the room was the one who could absorb discomfort without reacting to it. I thought grace meant endless restraint. I thought dignity meant silence. I was wrong. A grown woman is not the woman who says the least. A grown woman is the woman who knows the difference between when to speak, when to protect herself, and when to go quiet. Those are not the same skill. And most girls learn them too late. Before we go deeper, subscribe to the channel if this already feels like a conversation you have been needing. This space is for women who are tired of surface advice, tired of being spoken to like a project, tired of being told to perform strength when what they really need is language for what they have lived. If this kind of story stays with you, subscribe and stay close. What changed my life was not simply finding my voice. People say that like it is one clean moment, one triumphant scene, one neat declaration. But that is not how it happened for me. It was messier than that. More private. More humbling. I had to learn that every situation was not asking the same thing from me. Some moments were asking me to speak up. Not because I wanted attention. Not because I wanted to control the room. Not because I had become combative or hard, but because my truth deserved air. Because I had spent too many years editing myself down to make other people more comfortable with my presence. Because every time I swallowed a real thought just to be liked, I taught myself that my inner life was negotiable. There are women who have spent entire decades talking around what they mean. At work, I have seen it happen in polished conference rooms, where a woman has an idea, a sharper idea, a better idea, but she waits just a beat too long, and the space gets taken by someone louder. Then the meeting moves on, and she tells herself it was not worth interrupting. She tells herself timing was off. She tells herself she will say it next time. But after enough next times, silence becomes a habit that starts dressing itself up as humility. I know that kind of silence. It looks graceful from far away. But up close, it leaves a bruise. Speaking up is not about becoming the loudest woman in the room. It is about refusing to keep living as if my inner voice is optional. It is about understanding that my perspective has weight even when it changes the mood. Even when it disrupts an expectation. Even when someone else was more comfortable with the version of me that never interrupted the script. Then there are moments that ask more than speech. They ask for protection. And protection is where many women get called difficult. There is something deeply unfair in the way the world responds when a woman defends herself. A man can be seen as decisive, assertive, a leader, someone who knows how to stand his ground. A woman does it and suddenly she is a problem, too sensitive, too intense, too guarded, too dramatic. So many of us learned early that the social cost of self-protection can feel higher than the pain of disrespect. So we laugh things off. We keep it classy. We give second chances to people who have not even named what they did. We accept apologies that are really evasions. We tell ourselves they did not mean it that way. But impact has never needed permission from intention. If someone speaks to me in a way that diminishes me, confuses me, belittles me, needles me, or quietly erodes my dignity, I do not need courtroom-level evidence to know I felt it. I do not need a unanimous vote to decide a line was crossed. I do not need to wait until the harm becomes spectacular. A grown woman protects herself earlier than that. She does not wait for devastation to validate her instincts. That kind of defense is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is one sentence, spoken cleanly. Sometimes it is "do not speak to me like that again." Sometimes it is "that does not work for me." Sometimes it is a changed tone, a closed door, a no that does not come with a thesis statement attached. Sometimes the most mature thing I can do is stop over-explaining why I deserve basic respect. And then there is the third skill. The most misunderstood one. The one people romanticize or misuse depending on what they need from me. Knowing when to go quiet. Not because I am powerless. Not because I have nothing to say. Not because I am intimidated. But because discernment has taught me that not every invitation deserves my presence. Not every comment deserves my energy. Not every provocation deserves my nervous system. There is a silence that comes from fear, and there is a silence that comes from power. They do not feel the same in the body. Fear makes me small. Power makes me still. I have had to learn that some people do not want clarity. They want access. They want a reaction. They want evidence that they can still disturb my peace. They want me in the mud with them because chaos is the only language they know how to speak. And one of the most expensive mistakes I made when I was younger was treating every challenge like it deserved a response. I thought I was standing up for myself when really I was wasting myself. I confused reaction with strength. I confused having the last word with having dignity. But a grown woman understands that restraint is not the absence of courage. Sometimes it is the highest form of it. Sometimes silence is me refusing to hand my emotional energy to someone who has done nothing to earn it. Sometimes silence is me trusting that what is true does not need frantic defense. Sometimes silence is me choosing the future I want over the temporary satisfaction of proving a point to someone committed to misunderstanding me. This is where maturity becomes art. Because the hardest part is not learning one of these habits. The hardest part is learning the difference between them while real life is happening. In real time. In the middle of a conversation. In the sting of a family gathering. In the humiliation of being interrupted. In the ache of being dismissed by someone I love. In the heat of a text message I could answer in 10 seconds and regret for 10 days. Discernment is not glamorous. It is earned. It is earned when I speak too late and feel the heaviness of another self-betrayal. It is earned when I defend myself too sharply and realize pain was talking faster than wisdom. It is earned when I stay quiet for the right reason and feel the strange, holy relief of not abandoning my peace just to win a pointless moment. A lot of women want rules. Always speak up. Always protect yourself. Never let anything slide. Ignore everyone. Cut everyone off. But grown womanhood is rarely that clean. Life does not hand me neat categories. It hands me human complexity. It hands me mixed motives, subtle disrespect, unfinished grief, old conditioning, public politeness hiding private contempt. It hands me rooms where I have to decide, with no script in front of me, whether this moment needs my voice, my boundary, or my absence. That is why this habit changes everything. Because once I learn the difference, I stop leaking energy everywhere. I stop explaining myself to people who are committed to reading me wrong. I stop calling self-betrayal patience. I stop calling fear maturity. I stop calling endless accessibility kindness. I stop calling numbness peace. And maybe most importantly, I begin to trust my own internal signal again. I learn the sound of my own no before it turns into resentment. I learn the feeling of my own yes before it gets buried under performance. I learn that my body often knows long before my mind is ready to admit it. I learn that the woman I am becoming does not need to be loud at all times, but she does need to be honest. That honesty has cost me things. It has changed the temperature of rooms. It has disappointed people who preferred the easier version of me. It has made certain relationships less convenient. It has exposed where I was only loved for my flexibility. It has shown me who felt entitled to my softness but had no reverence for my limits. But it has also returned something to me. It has returned my self-respect. It has returned my clarity. It has returned the quiet dignity of no longer negotiating with my own soul just to keep the surface smooth. So when I say a grown woman knows when to speak, when to protect herself, and when to go quiet, I do not mean she gets it perfect every time. I mean she stops moving through life half asleep to her own instincts. I mean she stops offering the same response to every situation just because that response once kept her safe. I mean she becomes a woman who can read a room without losing herself in it. And if that kind of maturity feels late, if it feels like I should have learned it years ago, if it hurts to realize how long I confused silence with grace, I understand that too. But late is still in time. Because there comes a point in a woman's life when being liked is no longer enough compensation for being lost. And when that point arrives, something in her begins to sharpen. Not into cruelty. Not into performance. Not into hardness. Into truth. A grown woman goes against the grain without apologizing for it. There is a moment in a woman's life that does not look dramatic from the outside, but it changes everything. It is the moment I begin to suspect that the life I have been living may be respectable, functional, even beautiful in places, and still not entirely mine. That realization does not usually arrive with fireworks. It comes quietly. It comes while I am driving home in silence after a dinner where I smiled at all the right moments and still felt absent the whole night. It comes when I look around my own home and notice that every corner reflects a version of me that knew how to be acceptable, but not necessarily how to be honest. It comes when I hear myself explaining my choices in a tone that sounds reasonable, polished, grown, and underneath all of that, hollow. It comes when I realize how much of my life was built out of adaptation. For a long time, I thought maturity meant learning how to fit. Fit the room. Fit the role. Fit the timeline. Fit the expectations of the family I came from, the culture around me, the people who said they loved me, the institutions that rewarded polished obedience, the invisible script handed to women so early that many of us mistake it for instinct. There is a path that gets laid out in front of a girl before she is old enough to question it. Be likable. Be sensible. Be stable. Be pleasing. Make choices that can be explained. Build a life that photographs well. Do not confuse people. Do not become too difficult to summarize. And for years, that can look like wisdom. It can look like discipline, when really it is fear. It can look like loyalty, when really it is self-erasure. It can look like gratitude, when really it is a reluctance to disappoint. It can look like maturity, when really it is a woman living too close to other people's definitions of what her life should be. Going against the grain does not always begin with rebellion. Sometimes it begins with exhaustion. I get tired of hearing my own life described in ways that sound correct but do not feel true. I get tired of being congratulated for choices that leave me emotionally underfed. I get tired of performing enthusiasm for routines, relationships, aesthetics, ambitions, and identities that no longer hold my actual weight. There is a special loneliness in being praised for a life that is slowly suffocating me. That is why this habit matters so much. A grown woman begins to understand that fitting in and belonging are not the same thing. I can fit beautifully into a life that is wrong for me. I can fit into a marriage that looks stable but feels airless. I can fit into a career that sounds impressive but asks me to betray too much of myself in exchange for applause. I can fit into a friend group, a family role, a social circle, a town, a body image, a version of femininity, and still feel like I am watching my own life through glass. Going against the grain is not about becoming rebellious for the sake of being different. It is about telling the truth when conformity has become too expensive. And conformity does become expensive. It costs women years. It costs us interiority. It costs us the small, sacred signals that tell us what is actually ours. Because when I spend enough time living by inherited expectations, I stop recognizing my own preferences. I know what looks good. I know what sounds responsible. I know what makes sense on paper. I know what will earn approval at Thanksgiving, what will keep the peace in a marriage, what will look tasteful in a neighborhood built around appearance, what will sound sensible to people who measure a woman's life by how well she maintains order. But that is not the same as knowing what brings me alive. That kind of self-knowledge often comes late because many women were never given the luxury of exploring themselves without consequence. Some of us grew up in homes where being good was safer than being real. Some of us learned early that experimentation came with punishment, ridicule, guilt, or withdrawal. Some of us built our lives during years when survival, caregiving, marriage, motherhood, work, or recovery did not leave much room for playful self-discovery. So we did what women have always done. We adapted brilliantly. We became capable. We learned how to carry things. We learned how to keep moving. But somewhere inside that competence, there can be a woman who has not yet met herself. I think that is what makes this chapter of life so quietly unsettling for many women, especially in midlife. By then, I may have done so many of the right things that it feels almost offensive to admit they did not answer the deeper ache. I may have a house, a career, children, routines, friends, responsibilities, systems, history, and still wake up with the disorienting feeling that I am living beside myself. Not because I have failed, but because I have become very skilled at maintaining a life before asking whether it reflects my actual nature. That question can ruin everything in the best and worst ways. What do I actually like, outside of what I learned to praise? What do I want, outside of what was expected? What feels nourishing to me, not impressive? What would I choose if I were not curating my life for interpretation? Those questions sound simple until they begin rearranging things. Because once I start asking them honestly, I notice where my life has become ceremonial rather than real. I notice the clothes I wear because they send the right message, not because they feel like me. I notice the weekends spent out of habit rather than desire. I notice the friendships built around old roles I no longer fit. I notice how often women are expected to remain loyal to outdated versions of themselves simply because those versions were convenient for other people. There is grief in that noticing. Going against the grain is not glamorous at first. It can feel disloyal. It can feel confusing. It can make me seem ungrateful to people who only understand life through the lens of duty and optics. It can disturb a whole ecosystem of expectations. Once I stop automatically agreeing, automatically attending, automatically performing, automatically choosing what is legible to everyone else, some people become uneasy. Not because I have harmed them, but because I have become harder to predict. A grown woman learns to survive that discomfort. She learns that not being easily explained is not a moral failure. She learns that disappointing the script is sometimes the first honest thing she has done in years. She learns that there are people who only know how to love the version of her that stays familiar, and that realization hurts more than most women admit. Sometimes going against the grain looks major from the outside. It looks like leaving a career in Boston that paid well but drained the life out of me. It looks like ending a relationship that had all the right language and none of the right feeling. It looks like moving somewhere quieter, smaller, less impressive, because I want a life I can actually inhabit. It looks like returning to painting after 20 years because something in me is tired of being all function and no texture. It looks like cutting my hair, not as a symbolic reinvention for other people to comment on, but because I no longer want to maintain a version of femininity that feels like labor. But sometimes it is much less visible than that. Sometimes it is choosing not to attend another gathering that leaves me depleted for 3 days afterward. Sometimes it is refusing to keep laughing at jokes that require me to diminish myself. Sometimes it is admitting that I no longer want the kind of life I once chased. Sometimes it is liking quieter things than the culture tells me to like. Sometimes it is declining to turn every private joy into content, every meaningful change into an announcement, every fresh beginning into a performance. Some of the deepest acts of self-definition are almost invisible. I think women are often taught to imagine authenticity as dramatic. A dramatic career pivot. A dramatic divorce. A dramatic move. A dramatic confession. And those things happen, yes. But often the more profound shift is internal. It is when I stop waiting for my desires to earn universal approval before I honor them. It is when I begin trusting subtle attraction over external consensus. It is when I allow myself to want a life that is less glamorous but more breathable. That matters, because a lot of women are not trapped by obvious misery. They are trapped by lives that are fine. Fine relationships. Fine jobs. Fine houses. Fine routines. Fine social circles. Fine appearances. Nothing visibly tragic. Nothing anyone can point to and say, yes, clearly, you should leave. And because nothing is ruined, I tell myself I should be grateful. I tell myself other women have it harder. I tell myself this ache is indulgent. But emotional starvation does not become noble just because it is quiet. A grown woman eventually realizes that gratitude and honesty can exist together. I can appreciate what my life has given me and still admit that some of it no longer fits. I can honor the younger version of myself who chose it and still refuse to spend the next 20 years trapped inside her unfinished understanding. I can stop romanticizing endurance. I can stop treating discomfort as proof that I am supposed to stay. What I love about this habit is that it returns complexity to a woman's life. Going against the grain means I no longer have to flatten myself into one consistent, digestible identity. I can become harder to label. I can want different things than I wanted at 30. I can be less eager to be admired and more interested in being awake. I can trade visible success for private relief. I can choose slowness in a culture that worships speed, depth in a culture that rewards display, privacy in a culture that confuses visibility with value. This is not about becoming selfish. It is about becoming congruent. And congruence is a very peaceful thing. Not easy, but peaceful. There is a different kind of exhaustion that arrives when my outer life and inner life are misaligned for too long. It makes everything feel heavier than it should. Small decisions become draining because I am making them from a fragmented self. But when I begin to live in a way that reflects something true, even imperfectly, I feel an unfamiliar steadiness. Not because all the answers arrive at once, but because I am no longer abandoning myself at every crossroads. The truth is, I have learned the most about myself not by staying where I was understood, but by stepping slightly outside of it. By ordering the thing I would normally say no to. By taking the trip that made no one else's list. By creating differently. Dressing differently. Resting differently. Loving differently. Working differently. By letting silence tell me what all the noise had been covering. By discovering that some of my strongest preferences had been buried under years of habit, politeness, and repetition. That discovery can feel almost embarrassing at first. To be this grown and only now learning what I like. Only now asking what I prefer. Only now noticing what kind of beauty actually moves me, what kind of work actually fits me, what kind of conversations leave me feeling fuller rather than smaller. But I think this is one of the hidden dignities of midlife. I am no longer trying to become a woman in theory. I am close enough to my own life now to know the cost of pretending. So yes, a grown woman goes against the grain without apologizing for it. Not because she is trying to shock anyone. Not because she believes different is always better. Not because she enjoys resistance. But because there comes a point when living by default feels more painful than being misunderstood. And once I understand that, I stop asking the room for permission to become recognizable to myself. A grown woman stops worshipping big dreams and starts building real steps. There is a particular kind of sadness that does not come from failing. It comes from waiting. Waiting for the perfect time, the perfect body, the perfect energy, the perfect season, the perfect version of myself who will finally be disciplined enough, healed enough, rested enough, confident enough to begin. And the older I get, the more I see how many women have not actually given up on their lives. They are still devoted to them in private. They still carry a hidden image of who they might become. They still want to feel more alive in their own skin, more settled in their finances, more honest in their work, more present in their homes, more connected to whatever part of themselves got buried under maintenance. The dream is often still there. It is not dead. It is just floating too high above the ground to touch. That is what changes when a woman becomes more grown. She stops worshipping the dream and starts building a staircase. When I was younger, I believed in transformation in a very dramatic way. I thought life would change in visible chapters, with clear beginnings and beautiful momentum. I thought if I wanted something deeply enough, I would eventually become the woman who naturally moved toward it. I thought desire itself had power. And maybe it does, but not in the way I once imagined. Desire can point me somewhere. It can reveal a hunger. It can expose where I am not fully alive. But desire alone cannot organize a life. It cannot wake me up early, repair my finances, strengthen my body, clean out a closet, finish a piece of writing, prepare for retirement, apply for the certification, leave the draining relationship, or carry me through the boredom that real change requires. This is the part many women learn late. Not because they are lazy, not because they are foolish, but because fantasy is soothing. Fantasy asks very little of me except hope. It lets me imagine the after without committing to the middle. It gives me the emotional pleasure of possibility without the friction of process. And for women who have carried so much for so long, fantasy can feel like the only beautiful room left in the house. It becomes a private place where I can still believe in more without having to look directly at how unchanged my habits have remained. That is why some dreams stay untouched for years. Not because I do not care, but because I care so much that I keep protecting the dream from the ordinary work that would actually make it real. I keep it polished in my mind. I keep it pure. I keep it distant enough that it cannot disappoint me. The trouble is, distance has its own heartbreak. There comes a day when I realize I have spent more time longing for a different life than constructing one. That realization can be humiliating in a quiet way. Especially for women in midlife, because by then the math feels louder. Time is no longer an abstract idea. It becomes physical. I feel it in the pace of recovery, in the mirror, in the calendar, in the way years begin to move. And nothing reveals the emotional cost of avoidance more than seeing how long I have called something important while refusing to give it structure. I may have spent years saying I wanted to get stronger, save more, write more, leave, begin again, rest differently, learn something new, take care of my body, make my home feel like mine, stop living in emergency mode. But if I never translated those longings into specific steps, then the dream stayed in the realm of identity theater. It stayed a beautiful sentence. It never became a life. A grown woman begins to understand that there is dignity in the unglamorous step. Not the dramatic declaration. Not the reinvention speech. Not the sweeping promise made in a surge of emotion. The step. The one that looks almost too small to matter. The one that does not photograph well. The one that seems beneath the grandeur of the life I say I want. Making the doctor's appointment. Looking at the bank statement without turning away. Taking the walk. Cleaning the drawer. Canceling the subscription. Researching the class. Writing the first paragraph. Blocking the hour. Reading the policy. Asking the question. moving the chair into the light, going to bed earlier, buying the planner, saying no to the expense, measuring what I have spent, measuring what I have avoided, beginning in a way that does not flatter my ego. That is the part that changes a woman's life. I think many of us were raised on extremes. Dream big. Go all in. Reinvent yourself. Start over. Chase your passion. Or, on the other side, be practical, be realistic, be grateful, do not ask for too much. But what often goes missing in between those two poles is mature planning. The quiet intelligence of breaking a life into workable pieces. The kind of thinking that does not despise ambition, but does not romanticize it either. The kind of thinking that asks not only what do I want, but what would this require of me on a Tuesday? That question has saved me more than inspiration ever did. Because Tuesday is where truth lives. Not in the fantasy of who I could become under perfect conditions, but in the actual architecture of my ordinary days. If I say I want a stronger body, what does Tuesday ask? If I say I want to feel less trapped financially, what does Tuesday ask? If I say I want to leave the job in Boston that has drained me dry, what does Tuesday ask? If I say I want more peace in my home, what does Tuesday ask? If I say I want to write, what does Tuesday ask? Usually, it asks for something much less cinematic than my mind prefers. It asks for consistency before confidence. It asks for repetition before results. It asks for patience before proof. It asks me to tolerate being unimpressive for a while. That last part can be especially hard. Many women are willing to dream, but struggle to begin in a way that feels small enough to protect. We want our effort to immediately resemble the final outcome. We want the first month to already look like momentum. We want evidence that we are not too late, not too old, not too behind, not too tired, not too damaged by the years we have already spent elsewhere. But grown womanhood teaches me something steadier than that. It teaches me that urgency is not always wisdom. Sometimes urgency is grief panicking. Sometimes it is shame trying to outrun regret. Sometimes it is the fear that if change does not happen quickly, it will not happen at all. So I overreach. I make enormous plans. I design dramatic routines. I set standards that cannot survive a tired week, a family crisis, a difficult month, a hormonal shift, a bad night of sleep, a stretch of low mood, or the simple fact of being human. Then I fail to maintain the plan and use that failure as proof that I lack discipline, when really the structure itself was built with no tenderness for the realities of my life. A grown woman stops doing that to herself. She stops confusing punishment with commitment. She stops building systems based on fantasy energy. She starts telling the truth about her actual capacity, not as an excuse, but as useful information. She knows that sustainable change is not built on an imaginary woman. It is built on the woman who is actually here. That means I stop asking, what would be the most impressive version of this goal, and start asking, what can I repeat without disappearing from my own life? That is a very different question. For health, it may not be a total physical overhaul. It may be a morning walk, 3 days a week, and a kitchen that makes one nourishing choice easier. For money, it may not be an instant financial rebirth. It may be opening the account, learning the numbers, tracking what leaks out of me every month, and making decisions that look boring before they look powerful. For creative life, it may not be a grand return. It may be 1 hour on Saturday morning at the table, before the world starts asking things from me. For home, it may not be a full reinvention. It may be one room that finally feels restful, one drawer that is no longer chaos, one lamp lit in the evening as a sign that I am not only living here, I am tending to myself here. For emotional repair, it may not be a complete healing arc. It may be noticing the pattern earlier, staying in the room with my own feelings longer, calling the thing by its real name. This is why real steps matter so much. They force honesty. A dream can remain flattering forever. A step exposes whether I am willing to convert longing into behavior. And behavior tells the truth. It tells me what I value enough to structure. It tells me what I keep postponing because I am still waiting to feel ready. It tells me what I have romanticized instead of respected. It tells me where I am still hoping for rescue, luck, timing, or mood to do what only practice can do. That can sound harsh, but I do not mean it harshly. In fact, I think this shift is one of the kindest things a woman can learn. Because once I stop worshipping the dream, I stop using it to torment myself. I stop standing in the gap between my current life and my imagined life just to feel inadequate. I stop using big visions as a mirror that only reflects what I have not done. I begin using them as maps instead. A map is gentler than a fantasy. A map assumes movement. It does not require glamour. It does not ask me to become someone else overnight. It simply says, here you are, and here is the next turn. There is peace in that. Real peace. Not the peace of giving up, but the peace of no longer being dazzled by extremes. No longer seduced by the idea that my whole life must transform at once in order to matter. No longer ashamed of modest progress. No longer waiting for a cleaner season of life to begin tending to what I say is precious. I think this matters especially for women who have spent years caring for everyone else. Because caretaking often trains me to treat my own desires like luxuries and my own plans like things to get to later. Later when the children need less. Later when work calms down. Later when the divorce settles. Later when my body feels better. Later when the house is quieter. Later when I am less tired. But later has a way of becoming a private cemetery for unlived lives. And part of becoming more grown is recognizing that some things do not need a dramatic leap. They need a place in the calendar. A line in the budget. A repeated hour. A deliberate system. A smaller beginning than pride would prefer. So now, when I catch myself speaking in sweeping language about the life I want, I try to ask a more intimate question. Not what is the dream, but what is the next honest step? Not how do I become entirely different, but where can I become more aligned? Not what would look impressive from the outside, but what would quietly improve the texture of my actual days. That is how a woman starts coming back to herself. Not always through revelation. Sometimes through logistics. Through structure. Through follow-through. Through tiny acts of self-respect repeated long enough that they become visible. And maybe that is the deeper maturity here. A grown woman stops needing her life to feel dramatic in order for it to be meaningful. She begins to understand that the future she longs for will not be built by intensity alone. It will be built by what she is willing to make real, one grounded step at a time. A grown woman learns self-discipline without turning herself into a machine. There is a version of discipline that many women are taught to admire, and I do not think it has ever really loved us back. It is rigid, cold, performance-driven. It is the kind of discipline that treats the body like a problem to solve, rest like weakness, tenderness like distraction, and emotional needs like inconveniences that get in the way of results. It praises control but rarely asks what that control is costing. It rewards output, visible progress, measurable change, polished effort. It has very little patience for grief, fatigue, hormonal shifts, loneliness, caregiving, recovery, or the emotional weather of being human. And because so many women were raised to be useful before they were taught to be whole, that kind of discipline can look almost holy at first. It can look like virtue. It can look like commitment. It can even look like adulthood. But a grown woman eventually learns the difference between discipline that strengthens her life and discipline that slowly empties it out. That distinction matters more than people admit. Because many women do not actually struggle with effort. They struggle with how often their effort has been severed from care. I know what it is to keep going. I know how to show up when I am tired. I know how to override myself. I know how to finish the task, answer the message, meet the deadline, carry the mental load, take care of the details nobody sees, and still somehow be told I need more discipline. What I have had to learn, as I have grown older, is that self-discipline is not about becoming harder on myself than life has already been. It is not about turning myself into a machine so I can produce a more acceptable version of my existence. It is about becoming trustworthy to myself in the quiet places where no one is clapping. That is a very different thing. When I was younger, I often thought discipline meant intensity. It meant the dramatic restart, the strict routine, the total overhaul, the promise that this time I would do everything right, all at once, with enough force to erase the evidence of every year I had been inconsistent, overwhelmed, avoidant, or emotionally scattered. I would make rules in a burst of frustration. I would decide I was done with the version of me who procrastinated, overspent, overate, stayed up too late, checked my phone too often, let my energy leak into the wrong places, stayed attached to the wrong people, abandoned routines the moment life became inconvenient. I would create a beautiful fantasy of order. And for a little while, it would feel almost intoxicating. But fantasy energy is not the same as discipline. Fantasy is emotional. Discipline is relational. That is what I have come to believe. Discipline is a relationship with myself. It is the tone I use when I need to hold a line. It is whether I know how to guide myself without humiliating myself. It is whether I can create structure without turning structure into punishment. It is whether I know how to remain devoted to what matters after the mood has changed, after the adrenaline has faded, after life has become ordinary again. And ordinary is where most women lose themselves. Not because the dream disappears, but because the day arrives. The actual day. The Wednesday where I am tired. The Sunday evening where I want comfort more than intention. The morning where the weather is bad, my mind is crowded, the kitchen is a mess, my body feels heavy, and nobody would know if I let the promise slide. That is where discipline reveals itself. Not in the fantasy of transformation, but in the private act of continuing. Still, I think it is important to be honest. Many women resist discipline not because they are unserious, but because they associate discipline with emotional violence. They have lived inside marriages, families, workplaces, religions, beauty standards, and systems that already demanded relentless self-control. They know what it feels like to be watched, corrected, managed, and measured. So when they hear the word discipline, something inside them tightens. It sounds like more pressure, more performance, more denial. More of the same old story where a woman's body, time, appetite, and emotions are only respected when they are under control. That is why a grown woman has to redefine it for herself. She has to separate discipline from self-rejection. She has to separate consistency from self-erasure. She has to separate commitment from punishment. Because without that separation, she will either rebel against every structure that could help her, or become so rigid that she loses the softness that makes the life worth living in the first place. I have seen both versions in women. The woman who says she wants peace, but lives with no rhythm at all. The woman who says she wants stability, but keeps her life so open to impulse, interruption, craving, distraction, and emotional weather that nothing solid can grow. And then the woman who goes the other way, who organizes herself so tightly that she becomes brittle. Efficient, but unreachable. Productive, but joyless. In control, but not at ease. Neither one is truly free. A grown woman learns something more subtle. She learns that discipline is not about squeezing all the wildness, spontaneity, and humanness out of her life. It is about protecting what matters from her own patterns of neglect. That can show up in places people rarely romanticize. In sleep, for instance. One of the quietest ways women abandon themselves is by treating rest as negotiable. Staying up too late not because the evening is magical, but because those late hours are the only time that belong to me. Scrolling, watching, grazing, shopping, delaying bedtime because the day took too much and I want something back. I understand that. Deeply. But I have had to face the fact that sometimes what feels like comfort is actually theft. I rob tomorrow's version of me just to soothe tonight's exhaustion. Discipline, in that moment, is not me becoming severe. It is me deciding that the woman I will be in the morning deserves some protection from the woman I am at midnight. Or money. Women do not always talk honestly about the emotional life of spending. Not just bills and budgets, but spending as anesthesia. Spending as reward. Spending as identity maintenance. Spending because I am lonely, bored, unheld, unstimulated, or trying to create a small moment of relief inside a life that has started to feel too functional. I know how easy it is to call that harmless. I know how easy it is to say I deserve it, and maybe sometimes I do. But a grown woman learns to ask harder questions than that. She asks whether the thing is really care, or whether it is a brief mood management strategy that leaves her more fragmented later. Discipline, in this area, is not about denial for its own sake. It is about refusing to let emotional emptiness quietly write financial decisions I will have to live with. Or the phone. Few things reveal the tenderness and weakness of the nervous system more clearly than what I do with my attention. So many women are exhausted not only because life is heavy, but because their minds are constantly breached. Notifications. News. Group texts. Work messages. Family demands. Quiet envy. Background noise. Endless commentary. Small digital cuts to the spirit all day long. Then we wonder why our inner life feels inaccessible. Why we cannot hear ourselves think. Why it takes so little to send us into irritability, numbness, craving, or collapse. Discipline, here, might look as simple as not reaching for the phone the moment I wake up. Turning it over during dinner. Not taking emotionally loaded texts into my bed at night. Creating one pocket of the day where my mind is not available to everyone else's urgency. That is not rigidity. That is stewardship. And then there is relational discipline, which may be the hardest kind of all. Because discipline is not only about habits like movement, sleep, money, work, and food. It is also about what I keep returning to emotionally even after it has shown me what it is. The man who only reaches for me when he is lonely. The friend who drains me and calls it closeness. The dynamic that keeps me in longing instead of peace. The pattern of reopening doors that should stay closed because part of me still wants the old story to end differently. It takes enormous self-discipline to stop volunteering for the same wound in a different outfit. It takes maturity to realize that chemistry does not equal safety, familiarity does not equal alignment, and craving does not equal truth. This is why discipline has to be rooted in self-respect, not self-hatred. If I dislike myself, discipline becomes punishment. If I fear myself, discipline becomes surveillance. If I do not trust myself, discipline becomes control. But if I care for myself, discipline becomes devotion. Devotion is a better word for what I mean. Not glamorous devotion. Not aesthetic devotion. Not the kind that can be displayed online in neat little rituals and perfectly lit routines. I mean the unphotographed devotion of being a woman who keeps a promise to herself because she knows what it costs when she does not. A woman who does the small thing not because she is obsessed with optimization, but because she has finally grown tired of living at the mercy of every mood, craving, distraction, and ache. That kind of self-discipline is deeply tender. It understands that I am not a machine. It leaves room for fluctuation. It does not panic when the week goes off course. It does not turn one missed habit into an identity crisis. It does not say, "See, this is why you never change." It knows how to begin again without dramatizing the interruption. It knows how to say, "That was a hard week, and the line still matters. That hurt, and I still need to care for my body. I am grieving, and I still need a little structure so I do not disappear inside the grief. I am tired, and I still need to protect tomorrow." I think that is what many women are truly longing for when they say they want more discipline. Not harsher rules. Not stricter punishment. Not another version of life where they are forever trying to earn their worth through flawless performance. What they want is a steadier relationship with themselves. A sense that they can rely on their own guidance. A sense that they are no longer at the mercy of what they feel in the moment. A sense that their life is not constantly being rearranged by avoidance. That reliability is deeply comforting. Maybe more than motivation ever was. Because motivation is romantic. It comes and goes. It depends on energy, hope, novelty, emotional momentum. Discipline is quieter, less seductive, less visible. But it creates something motivation never can: self-trust. And for a woman who has spent years overriding herself, neglecting herself, soothing herself in costly ways, postponing herself, or scattering herself across too many people and demands, self-trust feels almost sacred. It changes the emotional climate of a life. I no longer make promises to myself like a woman writing checks she knows will bounce. I no longer confuse desire with devotion. I no longer believe that because I want a different life, I am automatically participating in one. Instead, I begin to ask more intimate questions. What kind of structure would actually support me? What habits make me feel more like myself afterward, not less? Where am I repeatedly asking chaos to produce peace? What have I been calling freedom that is really just lack of discipline in elegant clothing? Where do I need more softness, and where do I need more honesty? Those are grown woman questions. And the answers are rarely flashy. They are often almost embarrassingly basic. Go to bed. Drink water. Take the walk. Do not text him back. Put the money where it belongs. Cook the food. Leave the phone alone. Write the page. Keep the appointment. Sit in the discomfort without buying something, eating something, checking something, or chasing someone. Repeat. Repeat. Repeat until the life begins to feel different. That repetition is not glamorous, but it is alive. It builds a woman from the inside. Not into a machine. Not into a perfect system. But into someone she can live with more peacefully. Someone whose habits are no longer quietly betraying her values. Someone whose daily choices are beginning, little by little, to sound like care. And that, to me, is what mature discipline really is. Not domination over the self. A form of love sturdy enough to have standards. A grown woman builds boundaries that protect her peace, time, body, and mind. There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep does not fix. It is not only physical. It is not the tiredness of a long week or a hard season or a body that needs rest. It is the exhaustion that comes from being too emotionally accessible for too long. From being entered without permission. From being interrupted, leaned on, explained over, volunteered, guilted, contacted, expected, interpreted, and slowly worn down in places no one else can see. It is the fatigue of having too many open doors in the soul. I think many women know this exhaustion intimately, even if they do not always call it by its right name. For years, I thought what I needed was more patience, more flexibility, more understanding, more grace, more resilience. I thought adulthood was largely about becoming broad enough to absorb other people's needs without complaint. I thought love meant availability. I thought kindness meant not making anyone uncomfortable. I thought being a good woman meant being easy to reach, easy to ask, easy to lean on, easy to take for granted. And because I could endure a lot without visibly breaking, people assumed I was built for it. Sometimes I assumed that too. But there comes a point when a woman begins to understand that endurance is not the same thing as peace. Just because I can carry something does not mean it belongs on me. Just because I can absorb a behavior does not mean I should keep allowing it. Just because I know how to survive constant intrusion does not mean intrusion has become harmless. That is where boundaries begin. Not in trend language. Not in polished phrases designed to sound empowered. Not in performance. Boundaries begin in the body, often before the mind is ready to admit what is happening. A tightening in the chest. A heaviness before answering the phone. Irritation that appears too fast. Dread before a family visit. A strange fatigue after certain conversations. The feeling of being crowded from the inside. That is often the first evidence that something sacred in me is being approached without enough reverence. The older I get, the more I see that boundaries are not cold. They are clarity made visible. They are one of the most honest things a grown woman can build. Because without boundaries, love becomes confused. Time becomes available to whoever reaches first. The body becomes a place others feel entitled to comment on, pressure, use, or disregard. The mind becomes a public hallway where too many people leave their noise. And peace becomes something I keep saying I want while living in direct opposition to it. I have learned that many women do not struggle with boundaries because they are weak. They struggle because they were trained to feel morally responsible for other people's disappointment. That training begins early. Be polite. Be respectful. Be helpful. Do not be selfish. Do not be rude. Do not overreact. Do not make things harder than they need to be. And somewhere inside those instructions, many of us learned to treat our own discomfort as less important than someone else's access. So we over-explain. We answer when we do not want to answer. We say yes while the body is already saying no. We keep receiving people in spaces they have not earned entry into. We confuse guilt with obligation. We call ourselves mature when really we are overexposed. A grown woman eventually has to face a difficult truth. If I do not decide what is allowed near me, someone else will. And most people do not arrive in my life asking, how can I carefully honor your emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual limits? They arrive with needs, habits, personalities, wounds, assumptions, preferences, urgency, entitlement, loneliness, and often very little awareness of the cost of their presence. That does not make them evil. It makes them human. But my humanity matters too. My life cannot be built around the idea that everyone else's needs are real while mine are negotiable. That shift changes everything. Because boundaries are not merely about keeping people out. They are about keeping me intact. They protect my peace, yes, but peace is not a decorative concept. Peace is functional. Peace determines how I think, how I love, how I sleep, how I speak, how I recover, how I show up in my work, how I respond to my children, how I experience my own home. When my peace is repeatedly breached, I do not remain untouched. I become shorter with myself, less patient, more scattered, more likely to numb, more likely to mistake depletion for personality. Many women are walking around calling themselves moody, detached, resentful, tired, low energy, unmotivated, when part of what they really are is unprotected. That word matters to me now, unprotected. I think of how carefully people protect the things they value. A home has locks. A bank account has passwords. A body has instinct. A private room has a door. Even the most ordinary things are given structure when they are considered important. So what does it mean when a woman has no structure around her time, her attention, her inner world, her rest, her emotional labor, her availability? It often means she has been taught to believe that being constantly reachable is proof of love. But I no longer believe that. I do not believe love requires unlimited access. I do not believe closeness means constant entry. I do not believe being needed is the same as being cherished. I do not believe compassion asks me to abandon discernment. Some of the hardest boundaries to build are not with strangers or obvious offenders. They are with familiar people, family, longtime friends, children who are grown enough to ask much of me but not always mindful enough to notice the cost. Co-workers who mistake reliability for endless capacity. Men who enjoy a woman's softness but recoil at her limits. People who have come to know me through the shape of my overgiving. These are the relationships where boundaries can feel almost like betrayal, because the old version of me was woven into the rhythm of that access. If I change the rhythm, the whole relationship has to reveal what it was really built on. And that can be heartbreaking. There is grief in realizing some relationships worked beautifully as long as I remained convenient. There is pain in seeing how many people called me loving when what they really meant was available. There is disappointment in recognizing that some forms of closeness were sustained not by mutual care, but by my silence, my accommodation, my flexibility, my willingness to absorb. Still, grief is not always a sign that I am doing the wrong thing. Sometimes grief is simply the cost of telling the truth. That is why boundaries require such maturity. Not because they are hard to say out loud, although often they are, but because they force me to tolerate being misunderstood. A grown woman learns that boundaries are not requests for everyone to agree with her. They are decisions she makes in order to remain psychologically, emotionally, physically, and spiritually inhabitable to herself. Sometimes that looks like language. Clean, simple, unadorned language. I'm not available for that. That doesn't work for me. I won't be able to do that. Please don't speak to me that way. I'm not discussing this. I need more notice than that. I'm going to head home now. I won't be answering work messages tonight. No. But some boundaries are quieter than speech. Sometimes the deepest boundary is not a sentence, but a changed pattern. Not replying immediately. Not opening the text. Not picking up the call. Not inviting the person over. Not sharing the private detail. Not going to the dinner. Not volunteering. Not being the one who always smooths things over. Not explaining myself to the point of self-erasure just so the other person can leave feeling comfortable. Women are often encouraged to make boundaries sound soft enough to be easily swallowed. Pleasant enough not to disturb anyone. Wrapped in enough apology to prove we are still nice. And I understand why. Niceness has protected many women in social situations where directness came with consequence. But at some point, niceness can become the costume I wear while betraying my own nervous system. It can become a way of offering emotional politeness at the expense of emotional truth. I have had to learn that clarity is kinder than prolonged resentment. Because resentment is what often grows where boundaries should have been. Not because I am unloving, but because the soul knows when it has been overrun. The body keeps score in ordinary ways. In the fatigue after saying yes again. In the short temper with people who did not even cause the original problem. In the strange numbness that enters spaces where I once felt warmth. In the delayed anger that arrives when I am finally alone. Resentment is often the emotional receipt for repeated self-abandonment. And a grown woman pays attention to receipts. She notices which interactions leave her feeling steadier and which leave her feeling invaded. She notices who respects one no and who treats it like the beginning of negotiation. She notices who only contacts her when they are in crisis. She notices who asks for her time as if it has no shape of its own. She notices who enjoys emotional closeness but disappears when accountability appears. She notices who loves her presence but has little interest in her boundaries. That kind of noticing is not cynical. It is intelligent. It allows me to stop treating every relationship as if it deserves the same level of access. Not everyone gets immediate entry to my mind. Not everyone gets my weekends. Not everyone gets my body, my private history, my grief, my peace, my effort, my emergency energy, my softness. Access should mean something. It should be shaped by trust, reciprocity, safety, reverence, consistency, and care. This is especially true when it comes to the body. I think many women have been taught to treat bodily discomfort as the price of being socially acceptable. Smile when touched too casually. Laugh off the comment. Endure the pressure. Explain the boundary gently so no one thinks you are dramatic. Override the instinct. Stay agreeable. But the body is not an object for diplomacy. A grown woman learns to take her own physical no seriously. She learns that hesitation matters. Tension matters. Fatigue matters. Unease matters. Her body is not a public negotiation. It is a homeland. It deserves borders. The mind deserves them too. Not every opinion gets space in me. Not every news cycle gets to live in my nervous system. Not every family conflict gets to become my internal weather. Not every criticism deserves a room in my head. Not every emotionally chaotic person gets to leave their fingerprints on my peace and call it intimacy. One of the most powerful boundaries I have learned is informational. I do not need to tell everyone everything. Privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is stewardship. It is the understanding that some parts of my life do not become more meaningful through exposure. They become safer through protection. A grown woman stops narrating her becoming to people who have not proven they can hold it with care. And yes, boundaries can change the shape of a life. They can make the calendar quieter. They can make certain relationships more distant. They can reveal loneliness I once covered with busyness and availability. They can expose how much of my identity was built around being needed. They can leave me face to face with the question of who I am when I am no longer endlessly offering myself up. That question can be unsettling. But it is holy too. Because on the other side of overexposure, something beautiful begins to return. My time becomes breathable. My home feels more like refuge than extension cord. My body relaxes. My mind clears. My no becomes less dramatic because it is no longer buried under months of suppressed anger. My yes becomes more honest because it is no longer automatically given. Love becomes cleaner. Presence becomes more genuine. I no longer have to resent the people I care about in order to keep caring about them. That is what boundaries give me. Not distance for its own sake. Integrity. Shape. Safety. Space to remain whole in the middle of relationship, responsibility, work, family, and all the ordinary demands of being alive. So when I say a grown woman builds boundaries that protect her peace, time, body, and mind, I do not mean she becomes untouchable. I mean she stops treating herself like public property. She stops leaving every internal door unlocked and then wondering why she feels so exhausted all the time. She stops making a virtue out of constant access. She stops believing that the only way to be loving is to be available beyond reason. Instead, she learns something slower, quieter, and far more sustaining. She learns to live like her inner life is worth protecting. A grown woman learns how to be alone without feeling abandoned. There is a kind of silence that can feel unbearable when a woman has spent most of her life being needed. Not because the room is loud when people are there and quiet when they leave. It is deeper than that. It is the silence that arrives when no one is asking anything from me, no one is reaching for me, no one is filling the space with urgency, affection, obligation, or noise, and I am left with the unnerving question of whether I know how to belong to myself when nobody else is in the room. I think that is one of the quietest turning points in a woman's life. Not when she learns how to survive loneliness, because many women have already done that. Not when she becomes independent in the polished, outward way people admire. But when she begins to understand the emotional difference between being alone and feeling abandoned. Those are not the same thing, though for many years I confused them. I think a lot of women do. Especially women who have lived much of their lives in relation to others. As daughters, wives, mothers, caretakers, partners, employees, organizers, responders, emotional translators, the ones who remember, the ones who hold the thread, the ones who absorb the temperature of a room and quietly adjust themselves to keep things from falling apart. When I have been needed for long enough, being wanted can begin to feel like proof that I exist. Being contacted can feel like evidence that I matter. Being included can feel like safety. So when life becomes quieter, whether through divorce, widowhood, children leaving home, emotional distance, changing friendships, or simply the slow rearrangement of midlife, the silence can feel less like empty time and more like personal rejection. That is why so many women fear being alone more than they fear being misaligned. They will stay too long in relationships that have gone emotionally stale. They will keep entertaining people who bring no depth. They will fill every weekend, every evening, every open pocket of life with errands, television, scrolling, casual company, background noise, and unnecessary busyness just to avoid the nakedness of their own inner world. They will tell themselves they are just social, just practical, just staying occupied, when sometimes what they are actually doing is outrunning the ache of not knowing how to sit with themselves without interpreting it as loss. I understand that ache. There is something profoundly exposing about solitude when I have not yet built intimacy with myself. Because when the noise falls away, I hear what has been waiting underneath it. I hear fatigue that I had no time to name. I hear grief that never got language. I hear desire that got postponed so often it started to feel embarrassing. I hear loneliness that is not always about lacking people, but about lacking contact with my own center. I hear the truth about what I miss, what I tolerate, what I envy, what I crave, what I am still pretending not to know. And that can make solitude feel sharp. It can make a woman reach for anything that softens the edge. A text, a call, a snack, a screen, a plan, a man, a bottle, a social invitation, another task, another reason not to be still long enough to hear herself clearly. But a grown woman begins to realize that constantly escaping herself is its own form of abandonment. If I cannot stay in my own company without immediately outsourcing comfort, distraction, or meaning, then I am still living as if my interior life is not somewhere worth staying. That realization is painful, but it is also honest. Because the truth is, many women were never taught how to be alone in a nourishing way. They were taught how to endure loneliness. They were taught how to keep functioning after disappointment. They were taught how to hold it together. But they were not always taught how to cultivate companionship with themselves. How to create a life that still feels inhabited in private. How to make an evening feel tender without needing witness. How to enjoy their own presence without turning it into a project, a punishment, or a waiting room for real life to begin. That is what changes as I grow more mature. I stop treating solitude like a temporary inconvenience and begin learning it as a relationship. Not a glamorous relationship. Not the kind that looks cinematic from the outside. Sometimes it is very plain. It is me at home on a Sunday afternoon with no plans, no messages worth answering, no urgent reason to leave the house, and a restless feeling passing through me like weather. It is me deciding not to panic. Not to make that restlessness mean I am unloved, forgotten, left behind, or wasting my life. It is me staying close to myself long enough for the agitation to settle and for something quieter to emerge underneath it. That quiet is where self-intimacy begins. I think self-intimacy is different from self-sufficiency, and that difference matters. Self-sufficiency can still be hard, defended, overly proud. It can become a shield. It can say I do not need anyone, when what it really means is I no longer trust anyone enough to need them. But self-intimacy is softer than that. It says I can remain with myself. I can comfort myself without denying that I still long for connection. I can build a life that includes love for others without requiring constant access to them in order to feel emotionally anchored. I can miss people without disappearing. I can experience a quiet house without turning it into evidence that my life has gone cold. This is especially important in midlife, because so many women arrive here carrying private forms of emptiness they did not expect. Children grow up. Marriages change shape. Parents age. Bodies change. Friendships thin out. Work becomes repetitive. The pace of life shifts. The house sounds different. The phone is quieter at certain hours. The social identity that once kept me busy no longer fills me in the same way. And suddenly I am standing in the middle of an ordinary evening, realizing that what I am grieving is not just a person or a chapter. I am grieving the structure that once made me feel continuously relevant. That is a hard grief to name. Because our culture tends to romanticize independence in women while quietly punishing the emotional realities underneath it. We admire the woman who handles everything alone, But we do not always speak gently enough about the ache that can accompany that life. So many women are praised for their competence while privately starving for tenderness. And when tenderness is not coming from outside, they do not always know how to generate it within. They know how to manage. They know how to endure. They know how to keep the machine of life moving. But they do not know how to make solitude feel warm. A grown woman learns that slowly. Sometimes it starts with very small acts. Making dinner in a way that feels caring even if I am the only one eating. Taking myself somewhere beautiful without waiting for company. Going to a museum in Washington, D.C. and allowing myself to linger where I want, not where anyone else is ready to move on. Sitting by the water in San Diego with no performance attached to the moment. Taking a Sunday train in New York just to look out the window and let my thoughts stretch. Going to a bookstore alone and not rushing through it like I am apologizing for being there by myself. Setting flowers in the kitchen not because guests are coming, but because I live here too. Learning to cook something new without needing to turn it into content, proof, or productivity. These things sound small, but they are not small in the emotional life. They teach me that being alone does not have to mean being in exile from pleasure. They teach me that my own company can hold atmosphere. They teach me that a woman can create meaning inside an ordinary day without waiting for someone else to arrive and validate it. That is what I think many women are really longing for when they say they want to feel more at peace alone. They are not asking to stop loving people. They are not asking to stop wanting closeness, romance, companionship, friendship, or family warmth. They are asking for a deeper internal steadiness. A way of being with themselves that does not collapse the moment the room gets quiet. Because the danger of not learning this is larger than loneliness. If I do not know how to be with myself, I become vulnerable to all kinds of misalignment. I keep people in my life past their season because their presence feels easier than my own emptiness. I confuse attention with intimacy. I let mediocre company occupy spaces that should have remained sacred because I am more afraid of silence than I am of emotional hunger. I stay reachable to people who do not truly nourish me. I overvalue being chosen because I have not yet learned how to choose my own life, my own rituals, my own presence with enough tenderness to make solitude feel less like punishment. This is why learning to be alone is not a side skill. It is a form of emotional independence. It changes how I date. It changes how I grieve. It changes how I leave. It changes how I return. It changes the kinds of people I allow near me, because once I am no longer terrified of my own company, I stop treating poor company like relief. That is one of the quiet powers of solitude. It sharpens my standards without making me bitter. It shows me how much noise I once tolerated just to avoid feeling empty. It teaches me what actually restores me. Not all company is comforting. Not all socializing is connection. Not all business is life. Sometimes the loneliest version of me was not the woman sitting by herself at home. Sometimes it was the woman laughing at a table where nobody truly knew her. Sometimes it was the woman lying beside someone she no longer felt safe enough to reach. Sometimes it was the woman keeping herself permanently occupied because stopping would have forced her to admit how absent she felt from her own life. I think that is why chosen solitude can be so healing. It allows me to stop mistaking proximity for intimacy. It gives me room to hear what I actually need. It lets me rebuild a private world that is not merely functional, but companionable. A lamp turned on in the evening. Music that fills the room without asking anything of me. Tea made slowly. A walk without earbuds. A chair by the window. A journal I do not write in every day, but keep near because the point is not performance, it is access. A home that does not feel like a place I pass through while waiting for life to happen elsewhere. That kind of life does not erase longing. I still long. I still miss. I still want love, warmth, friendship, intimacy, witness. But the longing changes shape when it is no longer mixed with panic. It becomes cleaner, less desperate, less likely to make bargains with loneliness just to avoid feeling it. I can desire connection without making it my emergency. I can admit that I want closeness without letting that desire drive me back into places that make me feel less like myself. That is maturity to me. Not detachment. Not emotional self-containment so extreme that nobody can reach me. But the ability to remain whole in my own presence. The ability to spend an evening alone and not make it mean I have been forgotten by life. The ability to build rituals that reassure my nervous system that solitude is not abandonment. The ability to look at a quiet home and think not no one is here for me, but I am here. And that sentence matters more than it seems. I am here. For many women, that has not always been true. We have been physically present in our own lives while emotionally living elsewhere, waiting on someone else's return, someone else's approval, someone else's desire, someone else's call, someone else's schedule, someone else's crisis, someone else's need. We have been available to everyone except ourselves. So when I say a grown woman learns how to be alone without feeling abandoned, I mean she begins ending that pattern. She begins becoming someone who does not leave herself just because the room is quiet. There is a deep tenderness in that kind of return. It is not dramatic. It may not impress anyone. It will not always look exciting. But it changes the emotional structure of a woman's life. She becomes less grasping, less afraid, less susceptible to empty attention, less likely to overstay where she is unseen. She becomes easier to soothe, not because life gets easier, but because she has stopped treating herself like a stranger. She can sit in the evening and feel the ache of all she has lost and still not run from herself. She can hear the silence and not translate it as rejection. She can move through a day alone and still feel accompanied by something steady inside her. And that, I think, is one of the most beautiful signs of a grown woman. Not that she never longs, but that she no longer disappears in the waiting. A grown woman corrects her path without making her past a prison. There is a very specific kind of sorrow that arrives when I realize I have outgrown a life I once worked very hard to build. It is not the clean sorrow of obvious ruin. It is more complicated than that. Because sometimes the life is not terrible. Sometimes it is functional, respectable, even beautiful in parts. Sometimes it is the job I fought to get, the marriage I tried to protect, the city I once felt proud to live in, the version of myself that carried me through years I barely had the strength to survive. And yet, one day, I can feel it with a clarity that is almost frightening. What once held me is no longer where I belong. That realization can shake a woman more than people understand. Not only because change is hard, but because many women have been taught to treat endurance as virtue. Stay. Make it work. Be grateful. Follow through. Do not waste what you built. Do not embarrass yourself by changing course too late. Do not become unstable. Do not unravel the life everyone has already gotten used to. There is so much moral praise around staying the course that many women confuse persistence with wisdom, even when the path has gone spiritually dead beneath their feet. So they keep walking. They keep waking up in the same house, driving the same route, answering the same kinds of emails, having the same shallow conversations, carrying the same old identity through rooms that stopped fitting years ago. They keep making a home inside a life that feels increasingly airless. And because nothing is collapsing dramatically, they tell themselves they must be overreacting. They tell themselves this is adulthood. This is what it means to be realistic. This is what happens when the dream settles. They call it maturity, when often it is simply fear wearing good manners. But a grown woman learns something many girls are not taught early enough. Changing direction is not the same as failing. In fact, some of the most mature decisions I have ever seen women make were not about staying committed to an old plan. They were about telling the truth when the old plan no longer reflected who they had become. That kind of truth is expensive. Because correcting my path requires more than courage. It requires me to grieve the woman who chose the original path in the first place. And that grief is rarely simple. I may judge her. I may pity her. I may feel angry that she stayed so long, said yes so quickly, trusted the wrong thing, ignored the signs, wanted what she was taught to want, confused stability with aliveness, or built a whole chapter of her life around a set of values she had not yet examined deeply. I may look back and think, how did I not know? How did I not see it? Why did I spend so many years here? But that question can become a cage if I do not answer it with mercy. Because the truth is, I made many decisions with the tools I had at the time. I chose with the level of self-knowledge I had then. I loved with the emotional vocabulary I had then. I tolerated what I had been taught was normal. I pursued what I believed would keep me safe, respected, lovable, or secure. And maybe now, with more years behind me, I can see the limitations of that woman's vision. But she was still me. She was not stupid. She was trying to build a life from the resources she had. She was doing her best with the consciousness available to her then. A grown woman learns how to honor that without remaining trapped inside it. That is the difference. Because there are women who spend decades living in conversation with their former selves, but not in a healthy way. They are either forever defending the past or forever punishing themselves for it. Both can become prisons. If I defend the past too fiercely, I refuse to admit that I need change. If I punish myself too harshly, I drain all my energy into regret and leave none for redirection. Either way, my life stays still. And stillness is not always peace. Sometimes it is fear refusing to move. I think one of the hardest things for women in midlife is admitting that a path no longer feels true after so much has already been invested in it. By then, there may be history, money, children, reputation, community, routines, obligations, logistics, memory. There may be a home that took years to build, a profession that once made me proud, a relationship others still assume is solid, a city that became part of my identity. The cost of changing feels enormous, so I start bargaining with myself. Maybe I can endure it a little longer. Maybe this feeling will pass. Maybe I am just tired. Maybe all women feel this way. Maybe this is the best it gets. But sometimes the best it gets is just the story I tell myself when I am too frightened to imagine a revision. And revision can feel humiliating. There is a specific humiliation many women carry around starting over. Not the humiliation of being incapable, but the humiliation of being visible in change. Of having to say, actually, this is no longer working. Actually, I thought this was my life, but it was a chapter. Actually, I need to go back, relearn, redirect, downsize, untangle, begin again in a way I did not expect at this age. That can bruise the ego. It can make a woman feel exposed, especially in a culture that rewards certainty and punishes nuance. Women are expected to get it right beautifully, quietly, efficiently. Not to revise in public. Not to pivot after 40. Not to admit that what made sense in one season has become unbearable in another. But life is not static just because my pride wants it to be. That is something I had to understand deeply. The fact that I once chose something does not mean I must serve it forever. The fact that I once loved it, wanted it, worked for it, sacrificed for it, defended it, or built my identity around it does not make it sacred for all time. Some things are meant for a season. Some choices are bridges, not destinations. Some versions of my life are not mistakes, but they are also not permanent homes. That perspective changes how I relate to the past. Instead of asking, how do I justify all the time I spent there, I begin asking, what did that season teach me that I can take with me now? Instead of asking, how do I prove it was all worth it, I ask, how do I let it matter without letting it define the rest of my life? Instead of trying to erase the past or remain loyal to it, I learn to metabolize it. That is what mature redirection feels like to me. Not impulsive reinvention. Not dramatic rejection of everything that came before. But metabolizing. Taking in what the season gave me, releasing what it cost too much to keep carrying, and allowing the next version of my life to be shaped by what I know now. Sometimes that redirection is external. A woman leaves the job in Boston that once looked like success from the outside and admits that burnout has become a language her body speaks too fluently. A woman sells the house that made sense for the family she once had but now echoes with obligations she no longer wants to spend her energy maintaining. A woman returns to school in her 40s or 50s because she is finally ready to stop living only by necessity and start living with more authorship. A woman changes careers, neighborhoods, rhythms, friend groups, even wardrobes, not to become someone unrecognizable, but to become more honest. But sometimes the redirection is invisible to almost everyone else. Sometimes it is the decision to stop arranging my emotional life around whether I am chosen. Sometimes it is no longer making every calendar decision around obligation. Sometimes it is refusing to keep repeating a family role I have spiritually outlived. Sometimes it is ending the internal story that says I am too old, too late, too entangled, too responsible, too tired, too far gone to want something different. That story is one of the cruelest prisons women inherit. It sounds practical, but often it is despair trying to sound intelligent. I have seen women speak about themselves with such finality, as if a life can harden permanently by midlife. As if wanting something different at 50 is embarrassing. As if there is nobility in remaining trapped simply because the trap has history. As if suffering becomes more respectable when it is consistent. But what a small and brutal way to live. A grown woman knows that time matters, yes. But time is not only something I lose. It is also something that teaches. The years behind me are not evidence that change is impossible. They are evidence that I am no longer the same woman who began. Why would I demand that my life remain unchanged if I have changed? Why would I insist on being loyal to an outdated path simply because it is familiar? Familiarity can be comforting, but it can also be one of the quietest ways a woman betrays her own becoming. Correcting my path means being willing to disappoint the old narrative. It means accepting that some people will not understand why I need what I need now, especially if they were comfortable with who I was before. It means releasing the fantasy that I can revise my life without disturbing anything around me. Change has a sound. It moves furniture. It unsettles people. It reveals where my life was built on expectations I no longer consent to. That does not mean the change is wrong. It means it is real. And real change is usually less glamorous than people imagine. It is paperwork. budgeting, awkward conversations, quiet evenings of uncertainty, learning things later than I wish I had, feeling foolish, feeling tender, feeling relieved and terrified in the same hour. It is not always a beautiful leap. Sometimes it is a very adult crawl toward alignment. I respect that crawl more now than I ever respected certainty. Because certainty has often been overrated. Many women stayed in painful places because they were waiting to feel 100% sure before moving. But life does not always offer that kind of clarity. Sometimes all I get is the persistent ache that this no longer fits. Sometimes I only know that I cannot keep living in a way that makes me feel absent from myself. Sometimes the mature move is not made from confidence. It is made from honesty. Honesty says this relationship has become emotionally stale. Honesty says this job is costing me too much. Honesty says this version of my life was built for survival, not for wholeness. Honesty says I cannot keep treating my past decisions like a life sentence. Honesty says I am allowed to choose again. That last sentence can take years for a woman to believe. I am allowed to choose again. Not because the first choice was meaningless. Not because I was foolish. Not because I need to prove I am bold. But because being alive means I am still in conversation with my own life. Still learning. Still seeing differently. Still able to tell the truth about where I am and where I am not. I think this is one of the deepest forms of maturity, not getting everything right the first time, but knowing how to revise without self-contempt. Knowing how to look at a former version of myself with compassion instead of cruelty. Knowing how to say, that was real, that mattered, that shaped me, and it is no longer where I belong. There is so much dignity in that sentence. It frees me from the need to either romanticize the past or despise it. It lets me carry my history as information, not identity. It lets me become a woman whose life is not arranged around preserving old decisions at all costs. And maybe that is what adulthood really asks of me in the end. Not perfect forecasting. Not flawless judgment. Not a straight line. Just the courage to notice when the path has changed beneath my feet, and the grace to let myself turn. A grown woman stops romanticizing friendship and learns to place people honestly. There is a kind of heartbreak women do not always speak about with enough honesty, perhaps because it seems less legitimate than romantic grief, less dramatic than divorce, less visible than family rupture. It is the heartbreak of realizing that some friendships are being held together more by history than by truth. That grief is quiet, but it can cut very deep. Because friendship, especially for women, is rarely just social. It holds memory, witness, survival, seasons of becoming. The women who knew me when I was younger often carry versions of me no one else remembers. They knew the apartment, the haircut, the man I almost married, the way I laughed before life became heavier, the dreams I used to describe so freely, the family stories, the old jobs, the old fears, the old language of who I thought I would become. So when a friendship begins to change, it does not always feel like I am simply losing a person. Sometimes it feels as if a whole era of myself is slipping out of reach. That is why women often romanticize friendship long after the relationship itself has changed. We confuse longevity with intimacy. We confuse familiarity with safety. We confuse affection with alignment. We confuse shared history with present-day reciprocity. And because friendship between women is often spoken about in sentimental language, we can feel ashamed admitting that some connections no longer nourish us. It sounds cold, ungrateful, harsh, disloyal. Especially if no one has done anything spectacularly wrong. There is no betrayal dramatic enough to point to, no obvious villain, no clean reason that the outside world would easily understand. Sometimes it is just the slow, aching realization that I no longer feel deeply met here. I still care. I may still laugh. I may still love her in a certain way. But the relationship does not hold me like it once did. And because there is still goodness in it, I keep trying to make it mean more than it currently does. That effort can exhaust a woman. I think one of the most mature things I have had to learn is that not every friendship is meant for every level of access. Not every woman is a confidant. Not every woman is a travel companion. Not every woman is someone I should call in grief, trust in transition, lean on in tenderness, or bring into the most sacred parts of my becoming. Some women are beautiful company for laughter. Some are for history. Some are for occasional warmth. Some are for specific seasons. Some are for joy in small doses. Some are for the surface. Some are for truth. The problem begins when I insist on treating them all the same. That insistence often comes from longing, not wisdom. I want the friendship to be deeper because of how long we have known each other. I want her to understand me because I have already decided she should. I want the old closeness to still be available because admitting it has changed feels like a loss I am not ready to absorb. I want the woman who was good for one part of my life to be automatically right for the next part too. But that is not how human relationships work. Time does not guarantee depth. Proximity does not guarantee mutual understanding. Shared memories do not guarantee emotional safety in the present. A grown woman begins to accept that with more honesty and less fantasy. That honesty is painful because friendship grief is often made of subtle things. It is noticing who never asks the second question. Who keeps the conversation at a level that leaves my interior life untouched. Who can celebrate me in shallow ways but cannot sit with the complexity of my change. Who still relates to me as the woman I used to be, and seems unsettled by the woman I am becoming. Who only reaches when she needs an audience, a distraction, a ride, a sounding board, a witness to her life, but has little capacity for mine. Who loves me, perhaps sincerely, but only in the dimensions where I do not ask too much of her emotionally. These things matter. Women are often socialized to minimize relational disappointment until it hardens into private sorrow. We say things like, "She means well," or "that is just how she is," or "maybe I am expecting too much," or "we have been friends forever." And maybe all of that is true. Maybe she does mean well. Maybe that is just how she is. Maybe I am expecting more depth than she can offer. Maybe the friendship has lasted 20 years. But none of those facts erase the truth of my experience inside it. A relationship can be real and still insufficient. Loving and still limited. Precious and still no longer the place where I should place my most vulnerable self. I think this is especially difficult for women in midlife because by then friendship has absorbed so much emotional symbolism. Some women have outlived marriages, careers, identities, cities, and family structures with certain friends still standing in the background like proof that something endured. So when those friendships begin to feel thinner, more one-sided, more nostalgic than alive, it can feel frightening. Not only because I may miss the woman, but because I may have unconsciously used the friendship as evidence that some deep continuity in my life remained untouched. And yet, maturity asks more of me than sentimentality. It asks me to place people honestly. That does not mean discarding women casually. It does not mean becoming cynical, suspicious, elitist, or emotionally sterile. It means recognizing what a relationship can actually hold without forcing it to carry what it cannot. It means understanding that love and placement are not the same thing. I can love a woman and still know she is not who I call when my life is changing. I can care about her and still know she is not meant for my private grief. I can enjoy her company and still know that a weekend away with her would leave me depleted. I can keep the friendship and still reduce the level of emotional authority I have unconsciously handed it. This is a hard lesson because so many women suffer not only from how others treat them, but from how idealistically they place others. We elevate people too quickly. We let consistency in one area substitute for trust in all areas. A woman who is fun at brunch becomes someone we assume will be generous on a trip. A woman who listens well one night becomes someone we assume can hold our deeper history. A woman who has known us the longest becomes someone we assume understands us the best. But these things are not interchangeable. A grown woman stops confusing categories. She starts noticing what each relationship actually produces in her life. She notices where she feels expanded and where she feels edited. She notices who can handle truth and who requires performance. She notices who celebrates her growth and who subtly competes with it. She notices who can witness her joy without turning cold. She notices who keeps confidence, who remembers details, who shows up without drama, who offers reciprocity instead of emotional tourism. That kind of noticing saves a woman from repeated disappointment. Because disappointment often comes not from expecting too much in general, but from expecting the wrong thing from the wrong person. I think many women are not heartbroken because no good friendships exist. They are heartbroken because they keep offering sacred access to people who were only ever meant to stand in the outer rooms of the house. Then, when those women fail to hold the depth, the secrecy, the grief, the loyalty, the reliability, or the maturity I imagined, I feel wounded not only by them, but by my own misplacement. Misplacement is a quiet source of pain. It can happen with old friends. It can happen with new friends. It can happen with women I deeply admire. It can happen with women who seem warm, charismatic, available, fun, familiar, or emotionally expressive. None of that automatically means they are safe for the deeper layers of me. A mature woman learns to take her time with trust. She stops narrating her whole life to every woman who feels easy to talk to. She stops using emotional intensity as proof of closeness. She stops assuming that because someone understands one chapter of her life, they should automatically be included in the next one. She becomes more careful, but not colder. More precise, but not loveless. There is tenderness in that precision. It lets me stop making enemies out of women who were simply miscast in my imagination. Not every friendship that changes is a betrayal. Not every drift is cruelty. Sometimes two women are simply no longer standing in the same inner world. Sometimes one has gone deeper into herself and the other is not interested in meeting her there. Sometimes the affection remains, but the emotional vocabulary no longer overlaps. Sometimes the friendship survives best in a smaller form. And part of maturity is allowing that smaller form without making it mean the whole relationship was false. This is where grief and gratitude have to learn to sit at the same table. I can grieve that we no longer have what we once had. I can grieve that the conversations do not reach where they used to. I can grieve that I kept hoping for a version of closeness that the friendship no longer contained. I can grieve that she cannot come where I am going emotionally, even if she still cares for me in the ways she knows how. And I can also be grateful. Grateful for the chapter she held. Grateful for what we survived together. Grateful for the season when the friendship was exactly what it needed to be. These two truths do not cancel each other out. The friendship can matter and still need a different placement. I think women often stay too long in friendship confusion because they do not want to appear unkind. They would rather keep overextending, oversharing, over-explaining, over-inviting, over-hoping than risk being seen as distant. But clarity is more merciful than false intimacy. It is kinder to let a woman be what she actually is in my life than to keep punishing both of us for not being something deeper. Honest placement protects dignity on both sides. It keeps me from constantly reopening the same wound of unmet expectations. It keeps her from being silently judged for failing a role she never truly agreed to carry. This matters even more when building new friendships. Midlife can make women both more discerning and more lonely, which is a vulnerable combination. I may long for deeper connection and still be tempted to rush trust because I am hungry for companionship that feels real. But hunger can blur judgment. It can make me idealize early chemistry. It can make me treat being seen in one conversation as evidence of lasting safety. A grown woman learns to let time reveal character. She lets consistency speak. She watches what happens when she says no. She watches how the woman handles envy, privacy, inconvenience, truth, disappointment, mutuality. She builds slowly. That slow building is not guardedness for its own sake. It is respect for the emotional value of access. Because access should be earned. Not through performance. Not through history alone. Not through need. But through steadiness. The women who truly belong in the deeper rooms of my life are often not the loudest, flashiest, most constantly present, or most performatively affectionate. Often they are quieter than that. They remember. They ask. They hold confidence. They do not make everything about themselves. They can tolerate complexity. They do not require me to shrink, entertain, overfunction, or constantly translate myself. They bring ease without shallowness, depth without chaos, warmth without intrusion. They leave me feeling more like myself, not less. And the older I get, the more precious that becomes. Because time is precious. Energy is precious. Emotional openness is precious. Midlife teaches me that I do not have endless reserves to pour into relationships that survive mostly on memory, obligation, guilt, or social habit. I want friendship that feels lived in, not merely maintained. I want honesty more than appearance. I want fewer women in the innermost circle, but more truth there. I want to stop forcing equal closeness where equal closeness does not exist. That is not bitterness. It is peace. A grown woman stops romanticizing friendship and learns to place people honestly because she finally understands that confusion is costly. It makes her overgive where she should observe. It makes her overshare where she should wait. It makes her expect nourishment from places only built for convenience. It makes her call people close when what she really means is familiar. But familiarity is not the same as intimacy. And once I truly accept that, I begin to love women more truthfully. I stop dragging them into roles that do not belong to them. I stop using memory to deny reality. I stop asking every friendship to become sacred just because I am afraid of what it means if it is not. Instead, I let each relationship tell the truth about itself. Some are for laughter. Some are for history. Some are for beauty in passing. Some are for shared interests. Some are for occasional warmth. And a rare few are for the deepest rooms. A grown woman learns the difference, and that difference saves her heart from 1,000 quiet disappointments. What stays with me most about this story is not that I became a completely different woman. It is that I finally stopped abandoning the woman I already was. For a long time, my life looked intact from the outside. I was functioning. I was dependable. I was thoughtful, responsible, and emotionally aware enough to keep things moving. I knew how to be useful. I knew how to be composed. I knew how to make myself understandable to other people. But underneath that, I was slowly disappearing in places that did not leave obvious bruises. I was disappearing in the moments when I stayed silent to keep the peace. I was disappearing in the choices I made because they looked right, even when they did not feel true. I was disappearing in the dreams I loved but never built into real steps. I was disappearing in the habits that drained me, the access I gave too freely, the loneliness I kept trying to outrun, the old paths I kept honoring after they no longer fit, and the friendships I kept romanticizing long after they had changed shape. That is what this entire journey has really been about, not reinvention for the sake of image, but return. A return to truth. A return to self-respect. A return to a quieter, sturdier kind of womanhood that is not based on performance. I learned that maturity is not about becoming harder. It is not about having the perfect words, the perfect body, the perfect routine, the perfect boundaries, the perfect life, or the perfect emotional control. It is about becoming honest enough to notice where I am leaking myself away, and brave enough to begin closing those openings one by one. I learned that there is a difference between speaking and reacting. A difference between protecting myself and proving a point. A difference between peace and silence. I learned that not every room deserves my explanation, not every relationship deserves the deepest parts of me, and not every old version of my life deserves lifelong loyalty. I learned that going against the grain is not rebellion. Sometimes it is simply the first time a woman tells the truth about what she actually wants. I learned that dreams without structure become emotional furniture, beautiful to look at but impossible to live inside. I learned that discipline, when rooted in love, becomes a way of building trust with myself instead of punishing myself for being human. I learned that boundaries are not walls built out of bitterness, but doors placed with intention. I learned that solitude can become sacred when I stop reading it as rejection. I learned that changing direction does not erase my past, it honors the fact that I have grown beyond it. And I learned that friendship becomes healthier when I stop asking every woman to play every role in my life. Most of all, I learned that many women are not in crisis in the way the world recognizes. They are in a quieter place than that. They are carrying grief without collapse. They are carrying disappointment without spectacle. They are living lives that still function, while privately wondering where they went inside them. And because nothing is visibly broken, they often dismiss their own ache. They tell themselves it is not serious enough to count. But the ache counts. The numbness counts. The quiet disconnect counts. The feeling that I am no longer fully inside my own life counts. That is the deepest lesson I would want anyone listening to take from this story. The small betrayals matter. The subtle misalignments matter. The parts of life that look fine but leave you feeling absent matter. Women often wait for a dramatic event to justify change, but many of the most important turning points begin long before anything falls apart. They begin when I decide to take my own inner life seriously, even before the evidence becomes visible to everyone else. And that lesson can be applied now, in ordinary life, without grand declarations. It can begin by asking one honest question: where in my life am I still confusing endurance with alignment? Maybe it is in the way I let people speak to me. Maybe it is in the way I keep living by old expectations. Maybe it is in the dream I keep admiring but never scheduling. Maybe it is in the habit that keeps stealing from my future. Maybe it is in the open door I keep calling kindness. Maybe it is in the fear of being alone. Maybe it is in the path I know I have outgrown. Maybe it is in the friendship I keep forcing into a shape it no longer holds. The application is not always dramatic. In fact, it is often very small at first. It may be one sentence I stop swallowing, one invitation I decline, 1 hour I protect, one expense I no longer make, one walk I begin taking, one boundary I stop explaining, one evening I learn to spend with myself without panic, one truth I finally admit, one relationship I quietly place where it really belongs. That is how a woman starts coming back to herself. Not always through one huge transformation, but through a series of deeply honest adjustments. The outside world may not even notice them at first. But internally, everything begins to change. My energy becomes less scattered. My choices become less performative. My peace becomes less fragile. My life begins to feel more inhabited. And that, to me, is the real beauty of this story. It is not a story about perfection. It is a story about a woman who slowly stops negotiating against her own soul. A woman who learns that her life does not have to be loudly broken in order to deserve tenderness, truth, revision, and care. Because so many women listening do not need another lecture about fixing themselves. They do not need to be pushed harder. They do not need hollow motivation. They need language for what they have been carrying. They need permission to admit that fine is not always whole. They need to know that feeling lost does not mean they failed. It may simply mean they have reached the middle of their life and can no longer survive on performance alone. And maybe that is where the real life begins. Not at the beginning, when I was still building myself out of expectation. Not at the fantasy ending, where everything is suddenly perfect. But here, in the middle. Where I am tired enough to stop pretending. Wise enough to notice the cost of living disconnected. Tender enough to forgive the woman I used to be. Brave enough to choose more honestly now. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Now I want to hear from you. Here's a small question for you to answer in the comments. Which one is harder for you right now? A. Letting go of an old version of yourself. B. Trusting the new version of yourself. Comment A or B below. And if this story felt personal to you, I would really love to know your thoughts. Which part stayed with you the most? Which habit feels the hardest to live out in real life? Share your perspective in the comments so other women reading can learn from it too. And if this kind of content speaks to something quiet inside you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Your support helps keep this space alive for more honest stories like this.